Welcome back to Bitcoin Season 2 by Blockspace Media. I'm Charlie Spears.
I'm Colin Harper.
And this is Bitcoin Season 2 Writer's Room. It's a live stream on Fridays. Make sure you're tuning in on our X account at BTCSZN2 or the YouTube stream. This is where Colin and Charlie sit back, put our arms on the armchairs, and we enter the screenwriter's room. We are the screenwriters for Bitcoin Season 2 and all new things forward-looking in Bitcoin. But we're going to look backwards this time. In fact, today is a very special day, right, Colin?
It is. Today is a day where Bitcoiners around the world get off their sweaty, fat asses and attempt to run a marathon. They get halfway around the block, and then they puke up their chicken nuggies, and they get on their knees. And much like the call to prayer, they say a prayer to Hal Finney. And then Hal Finney blesses them with sick gains in the new year.
Exactly. And that's much better than getting on the knees for other such things, as we have spoken about here on this podcast in the past. But today is January 10th or 9th, depending on which way you're looking at it. And that is the day that Hal Finney tweets his famous tweet.
Running Bitcoin.
Which is running Bitcoin. Now, you got to remember, this was, January 2009? The Twitter you know today was very, very different back then. I don't know if you used Twitter back then, Colin.
No, I did not.
Okay. You had, like, this may blow up people's minds, but this is, I think, before the iPhone, or this was before the iPhone had the App Store. So basically, Twitter or any of these things as mobile apps was an entirely foreign concept. So you would use Twitter on your desktop, or I think actually at the time, back in 2009, people, including myself, would actually text one of those like boilerplate numbers, and you would text your tweets in. So I bet you that a lot of these tweets, if they're from 2009, are actually texts. And this is actually before I think retweets. I think they're before bookmarks. I think it's before likes. I think you could just tweet back and forth with people. So that is the Bitcoin, the running Bitcoin landscape that this tweet happens in.
Hal Finney, a serial early adopter of groundbreaking technologies. And just to provide color to what Charlie just said, obviously this is one of those kind of unofficial but official Bitcoiner holidays. There's like White Paper Day on Halloween. There's Bitcoin Genesis Day on January 3rd. Right, it is January 3rd. I'm not exposing my ignorance, right? There is Running Bitcoin Day on January 10th. A lot of stuff in January, obviously. Then there's like Bitcoin Pizza Day in May, and all of these things that Bitcoiners have used to kind of create this mythos of the Bitcoin religious calendar. And obviously Hal Finney is just almost an apostle-like figure in Bitcoiner lore.
Actually, I would say he's more of a disciple because he communicated directly with Satoshi. The difference between apostles and disciples is that disciples had direct contact with the Christ figure and learned from him directly. Whereas apostles,
the 12 apostles though were also the disciples, though, right? Like,
yes, but one of the defining things of disciples is that they were directly okay. We're getting a little bit too into Christology here. This is a Bitcoin podcast, and so it's interesting as we pull out unique, discrete, like things which made their way into the public internet about the early days of Bitcoin. And so what Colin and I are going to do is go through some of Hal's public comments and just kind of pull out the interesting stuff.
Yeah, and some of his early musings on Bitcoin talk. And just like one last thing to add to Hal's hagiography is the fact that he was the first person outside of Satoshi, allegedly, according to early communications, actually run Bitcoin, download it. He was one of the first people to communicate with Satoshi, if not the first, back and forth in the early days. He also received the first transaction that wasn't a mined transaction. Isn't that correct? From Satoshi himself?
Yeah, and so that's where a lot of the block, shoot, is it 469, 400 something, block 400 something, Satoshis come from ordinal theory, is they come from the very first transaction, which was 10 Bitcoin, uh, shortly around midway through January in early 2009. So that said, again, another a little bit more groundwork is that I think a lot of Bitcoiners probably take out of context Hal's words, and they probably are very selective with which things they like from Hal Finney. And some we're going to pull some of those and say that maybe they're directionally right, maybe they don't bring the full context, or maybe Hal Finney was just one guy among many different people in the cypherpunk scene at the time, and perhaps Bitcoin is an evolving ecosystem. So that said, I'm gonna hit you with it, Colin. You go first with.
All right, I'm going to share the dev mailing list post, the cryptography dev mailing list post that's also kind of, has been consecrated alongside the tweet where Hal says that he is running Bitcoin. And it's interesting that the system can be configured to only allow a certain maximum number of coins ever to be generated. I guess the idea is that the amount of work needed to generate a new coin will become more difficult as time goes on. Something that we'll return to throughout this entire conversation, as Charlie put it, this is the early days of Bitcoin. This was when it was still a hobby shop kind of endeavor for all of these cryptography nerds. People had been trying to um, create a kind of decentralized digital cash for a while. There were a number of precursors to Bitcoin. This was the first one that had a lot of working parts that would actually make it truly decentralized and in some ways self-sufficient. Not self-sufficient in the sense that it's like, totally autonomous system, but the incentives are aligned as such that all the participants will end up maintaining the chain. And anyway, a lot of what you'll see throughout this is them trying to figure stuff out, but also some just incredibly prescient takes from Hal in terms of how Bitcoin would pan out, assuming the adoption that we now know has occurred over the last 16 years. But so in this post, he's talking about Bitcoin scarcity. And he says, one immediate problem with any new currency is how to value it, even ignoring the practical problem that virtually no one will accept it at first. True, almost still true today. There is still a difficulty in coming up with a reasonable argument in favor of a particular non-zero value for the coins. Now, this part is wild. As an amusing thought experiment, remember, just thought experiments, y'all. Imagine that Bitcoin is successful and becomes the dominant payment system in use throughout the world. Then the total value of the currency should be equal to the total value of all the wealth in the world. Current estimates of total worldwide household wealth that I have found range from 100 trillion to 300 trillion, with 20 million coins. Interesting mess
He's
up
probably
there.
just rounding it. Ballpark.
Yeah, probably. That gives each coin a value of about 10 million. So the first 10 million price target was from Hal Finney in the salad days of Bitcoin right after it launched. I just think that's pretty funny because that's like
funny. It was crazy is like this valuation of $10 million for Bitcoin is still only been kind of a weird hyper bull Bitcoiner thing, even as recent as maybe a year or two ago. You did not have anybody serious outside of Bitcoin ever really predicting that $10 million per coin would be achievable. It's really only in the recent days, I mean, talking like months, I would say, since Bitcoin hit $10 or $100,000, that you've seen, like, I would say, legitimate, non-hyper Bitcoin crazy, like, institutions and researchers, putting a finger on the wind saying, well, it's like gold and it could be an order of magnitude greater than gold, which is exactly basically exactly, 100 trillion or $10 million per Bitcoin. So like, it really, this statement is really now coming into its own 16 years after Bitcoin was started. So shout out to Hal Finney there. And again, that is just back of the napkin math. Like, a lot of us believe that if Bitcoin is to succeed in other dimensions, that the US dollar exchange rate becomes less meaningful over time
Yeah.
because of how valuable Bitcoin is.
Yeah, and then it becomes a matter of valuing Bitcoin against goods and services. It's like, a common critique from people who think Bitcoin is silly and it doesn't justify its valuation. It's like, why is it measured against the dollar? It's like, well, because the dollar is the dominant unit of account for literally everything, especially in the Western world, or particularly in the Western world. And what I like about Hal's prediction here is this is under a mental model of Bitcoin as actual cash, which is an interesting divergence, or probably the biggest divergence, I think, between early proponents and adopters of Bitcoin versus the current ilk of people who use it as a savings technology. Is when it was launched, it was very explicitly created as a means of digital cash. That doesn't mean that it can't be other things. Obviously, it's metamorphosed into a number of different things for a number of different people. People use it as a timestamp server for certain things. People use it as a method for storing digital art and authenticating digital art. People use it as a store of value. A lot of people do use it as digital cash for online goods and services, and in some cases, physical goods and services. But Hal is specifically talking about it being used as a frequent means of exchange. And most people, when they use price targets for Bitcoin now, I feel like they rarely, like in the investor realm and in the analyst realm, they're rarely looking at it in terms of adoption as an actual currency. Do you think that's fair? I feel like that kind of doesn't register with people as much anymore.
This is an ongoing conversation. I mean, I often reference the Bitcoin narrative chart, which are the dominant narratives about what Bitcoin actually is. And Bitcoin as digital gold and as a savings technology is the one which is most dominant in the past 4 to 5 years, and which has coincided alongside this monetary maximalist view. But Bitcoin's primary narrative has evolved, and there have been different ones in the past. This is one of the reasons why the Bitcoin Cash fork and the block size wars was so confusing, is because um, the decision to not increase Bitcoin's block size carried with it the possibility that we could not have all the transaction activity itself beyond Bitcoin's base layer. And this was a decision we made as a community. So, or really as a community and as a market and stakeholders. So, um, it's not to say that that can't happen or be improved, but we've talked about this. But it's really interesting because there was an openness to considering Bitcoin from many dimensions at this time. I'm actually gonna take the reign.
Go
I'm
for
gonna
it.
take the helm on this one and show one of the other ones, the other things that Hal Finney said. Here is a post from BitcoinTalk.org, kind of the OG Bitcoin forum, where Hal Finney describes this idea of Bitcoin overlay protocols. Me being your token ordinals guy, this may sound kind of familiar because ordinals is a overlay protocol on top of Bitcoin. And he says, in discussion on the Bit DNS thread, which, by the way, there was a thread in the prior to this, which was saying we could make some kind of domain name system either alongside Bitcoin or in Bitcoin. So in discussion on the bit or in the BitDNS thread, I came up with an idea for overlaying other protocols onto Bitcoin. From one point of view, Bitcoin is a global, decentralized yet consistent database. This database is used to record transfers of coins, but it could potentially be used for more. There are many applications for a globally consistent database. This is, I would actually say, a more precise core definition of what this Bitcoin as a platform people actually mean. They might say that we're going to trade all these things on Bitcoin, but really at the core of it is that Bitcoin is this timestamp server for us to arrive at a consistent global state. And so further on um, in this post, he says, as an example, Bitcoin could be used as an inexpensive timestamp service, allowing you to prove that a certain document existed on or before a certain date. All you need to do is create a dummy transaction to yourself and hack the client to do an op push data of the hash of that document, then op drop it. The hash will be around for all time in the blockchain and stand as proof that the document existed at that date. Now, Bitcoin has changed a little bit since he posted this, because now the most efficient way to do this, instead of using op push and op drop, we have an opcode called op return, which allows you to include arbitrary data in a non-spendable, valueless output. And the modern implementation of what Hal describes today is Peter Todd's open timestamps protocol. I did a podcast with Carlos Torriello of Simple Proof. They are timestamping election documents to prove they existed and there was no election tampering. We talked with Peter Todd on the Mining Pod last year about Peter Todd's open timestamp service. So it's really interesting because these are non-monetary use cases of Bitcoin that Hal talks about and says are really interesting, cool use cases. And he gets immediately to this idea that, well, it doesn't make sense to like throw the entire big, heavy, multi-megabyte PDF in this transaction, but rather you hash it, create a very dense like proof of the state of this document, how it looks, and put that on a Bitcoin. That's a much more efficient, reasonable thing to do. So this is really, really interesting, fascinating perspective. This is December 4th, 2010, that Hal describes this thought. Maybe he did, maybe mentioned a bit before, but you know, I also want to say like the obsession with domain names and namespace is like one of the most like lizard brain like people like person on the internet things ever. Like I know we say that like, oh, even Casey is saying, you know, namespace and domain names are like a difficult to like they hardly make sense, but like we're all obsessed with them. We all
Yeah, I
want
mean, look at ETH, you know, .eth domain names, right?
I still renew my ENS domains. Like that's how like obsessed I am with this. It's innate.
It's a digital land grab. Like it really does kind of appeal to this Oonga Boonga part of our brain that says, you know, they will make no more of these things. One more thing to touch on about the about, you know, authenticating and hashing data via op return. I think this becomes increasingly more relevant in the age of AI. You know, Mark Andreessen's been talking about this a lot recently, about how in order to authenticate whether or not a piece of content is real, you're going to have to provide some sort of chain and some sort of chain of authentication or some sort of provenance for that, right? And blockchains are the obvious, I think, solution to this, at least right now. You know, because you could hash reference to a piece of content that comes from a public key that you've proven that you owned, and then if you don't, if users see content that was quote created by you, but that hash and that link is not there, then they know not to trust it. It sounds kind of in some ways convoluted and pie in the sky right now. I think partly because we don't have turnkey or low friction solutions to this currently for content creators and for general users of social media. But I think eventually something like this will probably have to be forced into the conversation, because it's about to get really fucking weird over the next decade. There have already been so many stupid deep fakes, you know, like especially crypto people will know this. You'll go on like a tweet and it'll be like a fake of Elon Musk being like, I'm giving away 1,000 Doge to the first people who do X, Y, and like drop your address. And then they try to get you to reveal your private key or something like that. So
yeah, interestingly enough, on the topic of like posting data, like imagine if it becomes commonplace where we need to timestamp the existence of videos and pictures that we make. So TLDR, the math, if we took all of the information of all the stuff we ever put on the internet and hashed it down into the maximum depth of a Merkle tree in Taproot, you can have a maximum depth of 128. You can have 2 to 128 spinning conditions. And if each of these clauses can be up to 4 megabytes in size, that allows us to encode effectively the entire estimated content of the quote surface web onto Bitcoin in just a handful of transactions, hash it on there. So we could basically prove the existence of all of the data that exists today on the internet in just a handful of Bitcoin transactions if we were to hash them. To the listener who got confused there, I'm so sorry. Maybe I'll dive deeper.
Insert Ron Burgundy meme. I don't believe you.
Exactly. but basically, yeah, that I went on a rabbit trail because you distracted me, or I went on whatever.
No, it's a good point. I think because it shows at least this is feasible at scale potentially.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are constraints to how much data we can publish to the Bitcoin blockchain at a given time. Something that we'll cover on the next post that we're going to look at, or at least one that I would like to bring up.
Yeah.
But with things like utilizing Merkle trees, and also looking at like things like batching these transactions into some sort of transaction service for something like this.
Yeah,
it's not out of the realm of possibilities. I think that there will be multiple services like this, though. Like Bitcoin will not be the only source of truth. Some people will be okay with a more centralized service and taking some trust assumptions, right?
Yeah. Bitcoin you don't need to do everything on Bitcoin. And if we do
What?
everything on Bitcoin. Whoa. Oh no, that's me saying that. So okay, tag you in. You do the next one.
Okay, so we're just talking about the limits to what can go on the base chain, and I wanted to pull this one up. I wanted to kind of do a twofer here. So first of all, let me see if I can get this one. Is this the one that I want? Yes. So I'm going to do this one first because I think it lays the groundwork. Jeff Garzik makes a good argument that the complexity of the scripting system is not being used and is unnecessary. Simple in and out transactions are all that is needed. I'm not convinced that there is anything that can be done with the Bitcoin scripting that can't be done with a crypto layer on top of Bitcoin to share or split keys, etc. So here we are, 16 years in the past. What was this? This is a December. Okay, not quite 16 years. About 14 years in the past, or 15 years in the past. And Hal is talking about layer twos. And he's talking about things that are still being discussed today, but without naming them because they didn't have the nomenclature then, like side chains, state chains, things like that, Lightning Network. I think this is really interesting because, again, the kind of subtitle for this entire segment is Hal Finney thought of it first.
Yeah.
And this is just a general rule. If you go back and look at Bitcoin talk from this time period, the fertility in the discussion in terms of ideas that are still taking root or growing today is just insane.
There is nothing new under the sun.
There's
if
nothing
you have
new
an idea somebody wrote about on Bitcoin Talk, ordinals is an idea from a decade ago from Bitcoin Talk. That's just how old this stuff is.
Yeah, 100%. And one thing I think a lot of developers today would take issue with the idea that scripting should be less complex. I think we're, at OpNext, we talked about the great script restoration and such matters. And I think that I'm not equipped to talk about that right now because my technical acumen has severely degraded since I started hanging out with the miners and only reporting on Bitcoin mining stuff.
They're so dumb.
But I just wanted to point this one out because I think it shows that scaling has been in the discussion from day one, including scaling that you might not like. And you should think about that because maybe there's a reason not to like it. But this harkens back to a piece that I remember reading a long time ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago now at this point, in 2018, which was one of Nick Carter's seminal pieces on Bitcoin scaling, where he says how to scale Bitcoin without changing a thing. And he's talking about Bitcoin banks, which is and he took inspiration from this Hal Finney post, I'm pretty sure. But in this post, Hal says, actually, there's a very good reason for Bitcoin-backed banks to exist, issuing their own digital currency redeemable for Bitcoins. Bitcoin itself cannot scale to have every single financial transaction in the world to be broadcasted to everyone and included in the blockchain. There needs to be a secondary level of payment systems, which is lighter weight and more efficient, Likewise, the time needed for Bitcoin transactions to finalize will be impractical for medium to large value purchases. Blah, blah, blah. I believe the ultimate fate of Bitcoin to be the, quote, high-powered money, end quote, that serves as a reserve currency for banks that issues their own digital cash. Most Bitcoin transactions will occur between banks to settle net transfers. Bitcoin transactions by private individuals will be as rare as well as Bitcoin-based purchases are today. This, I think, is perhaps Hal Finney's, in some cases, most unfortunate, depending on who you're talking to, but most incisive prediction for Bitcoin. Because what he's looking at, he's looking into the looking glass and truly projecting out what actual mass adoption from Bitcoin would be looking like. And this is exactly what's playing out currently. We don't have to like it. We can rage against the machine. And I do think there's a very salient argument to be raised about the fact that once you go down this road, Bitcoin loses a lot of its core censorship resistant properties. It becomes more permissioned, and you do end up having this kind of Faustian bargain for adoption, to where if you want to make sure that you can scale to billions of people, then you have basically a recreation of the current banking system, with the key differentiator being they cannot print more of the underlying asset unless they change the code, which we've talked about on prior.
Man, we could go around forever. We could do a whole episode talking about this and qualifying it, taking different angles on it. I think we probably should do this. Let's pin this as like an idea for an episode sometime. This is like one of those posts which I love and hate, because I think it is very insightful, and I think it's actually probably kind of true. But a lot of this, a lot of this is up for debate, because I like, really warrants some qualification, because like, is the deposit and exit from these banks analogous to existing banks today? Bitcoin is a programmable money. There are things we can do to add a lot of expressivity to the way this Bitcoin banking future exists. And so I think a lot of the debate actually in around the, say, just the covenants, but other Bitcoin scaling proposals over the next decade will probably center around various ways of like people not disagreeing that an idea of Bitcoin banks is a model which will dominate in the future, but rather to what degree should that dominate, and what are the trade-offs, and what can we do to improve that?
Yeah.
It's, one of the things that we look at when I read old Bitcoin talk form, especially like the cypherpunk pantheon of Hal Finney and others, you see a discourse, which you see a dialectic where they are talking about ideas, testing them out there. They will give predictions, but these are not like strongly held predictions. They want to discuss a lot of these things. And so I think if you're going to do some exegetical analysis that is trying to interpret the true meaning of their words at the time, then like I want to consider this in the context that he wrote it. So I view this as Hal Finney testing and prod, talking through a thing. He's very insightful, but
well, it's like the perfect crystallization of, or I shouldn't say crystallization, but it's the epitome of what Bitcoiners like to believe themselves as being, as truly adversarial and game theoretic thinkers. And a lot, some are like, that's not to disparage, our people, so to speak.
yeah.
But Hal Finney truly did have a beautiful mind for projecting out what Bitcoin adoption could conceivably look like into the future, which it to me lends itself to, I don't really have strong opinions on who is Satoshi. I actually think it's more fun to not think about that too much. But when you see these instances of Hal talking about these things and being almost retardedly clairvoyant in his predictions, it makes me think like, God bless it, maybe this dude is Satoshi, because his ability to actually grapple with these concepts and the kind of insights and attention that he brings to it really is not unparalleled, but in some ways unmatched compared to some of the other brilliant thinkers from this time or currently. I mean, we really do owe, not to like, get on my knees too much for our Lord and Savior Hal Finney, but he really is such an inspiring character for all of these things that we've been talking about on the pod today. Like, there's a reason he's so highly venerated, I think, even to this day.
Yeah. And that's really, really good. I actually think, given that we are at half an hour, I think this might be a good place to do two things to wrap up the Hal Finney, uh, story. So, here's a quote of his, which predates Bitcoin by over 20 years, by 25 years actually, from 1992, where he says the computer can be used as a tool to liberate and protect people rather than control them. And this is the heart and soul of the cypherpunk movement, using computers and cryptography and the modern technical tools we have at our disposal, um, as instruments of freedom. So, um, it's interesting because I think so many people today have Bitcoin as their exclusive and sole identity, whereas I think Bitcoin to the cypherpunks was another tool in their
Mhm.
overall
Yep.
identity of uh, of an ongoing battle for liberation, which that word today, is even kind of poisoned, but like it's, they are freedom fighters, but with computers. And so Bitcoin was a breakthrough in this game that is the back and forth of privacy and freedom.
And I really think this quote is kind of it's the soul of those who side with the more cypherpunk vision of Bitcoin today, and leads to some of the core tensions and a lot of discourse that we talk about all the time. That there really is this. There are multiple different subcultures in Bitcoin, but I think if you could boil it down into two, you would have the number go up maximalist versus the freedom maximalist. Okay, the balloons are popping up on the StreamYard because I'm doing a
Yeah.
piece. But and some people will say there's overlap in the Venn diagram there. I think that's true. I do think that there's an argument to be made, but the number go up portion of Bitcoin does lend itself to more freedom and liberation. Your net worth goes up. You can take risks with certain things. You can provide for you and your family more. But the core tension that we're seeing currently, I think, with a lot of Bitcoin discourses, what are we here for? Are we here actually to separate money from state, or are we here to all get rich?
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting because I think, I would say like the Noster camp of the hardcore Bitcoiners, seems to like actually align with this,
Mm-hmm.
because Nostr would be like a freedom technology, which happens to
Yes.
have found itself at the center of like a mainstream Bitcoin personality. And it's not Bitcoin. It's like another tool at the, broader cypherpunk movement disposal. So that's really cool. So, to wrap this up, today we saw the Finney Freedom Prize launch. If you didn't see this
Yeah.
news, a Human Rights Foundation and the Finney Freedom Prize uh, was created with the blessing of Fran Finney, who is the surviving spouse of Hal Finney, uh, and it was awarded to people who do the most for Bitcoin and human rights in each halving era. So I guess they're going to award it to specific people who, during each halving, uh, do the most. So they just awarded two halvings ago. That is the
So this was
um,
just today, but this was retroactively applied. Is that the idea?
retroactively applied. This was given to two guys who were active during blocks 210,000 and 420,000. That is the second halving epoch, the 2012 to 2016 epoch. Um, And
Peter
there's going to be
Wheeler and Greg Maxwell, two of the most prolific and consequential Bitcoin Core developers of their generation.
Two of the most consequential developers that are not Satoshi or Hal themselves.
Yeah, this is really cool. Like, shout out to the Human Rights Foundation. Alex Gladstein and Christian Carollas, formerly one of my former colleagues at Bitcoin Magazine, doing great work over there, incentivizing a lot of development that might not get done on Bitcoin otherwise. They have these grants that they issue on a quarterly basis. Some incredible tools have been built out because of that. So this was a great thing to highlight.
Yeah, so you love to see it. I would love to get Fran Finney on this podcast. That would
be awesome. Fran, if you're listening to this, cbs.spears@block.
That's not right.
Is that not it? What is your email?
It's in the video description. If you're watching this, it's in the video description.
Yeah, or Colin@blockspace.media. You can also find us on Twitter, or our DMs are open. We would love to have you on.
Yeah,
I know that your husband and yourself have made a huge impact on this entire ecosystem. Oh shit, Charlie.
What?
We forgot the most important post.
What's the most important post?
I can't believe that we